Hi, I am Samantha Neely, and I'm going to be discussing the fate of lactate today for this Cap 2 assignment. I'm going to start off by discussing the steps of the Cori cycle, which is more commonly known as the lactic acid cycle. This cycle is essentially comprised of two processes, glycolysis and glucogenesis, to put in simple terms. So in the muscle, we have glycolysis occurring. There's glucose in the muscle, and it has the option to go through anaerobic glycolysis or aerobic glycolysis. If oxygen is present, it can go through aerobic glycolysis, and the pyruvate can convert to acetyl-CoA and go through the Krebs cycle. But if there is an oxygen deficit, then that pyruvate is going to convert to lactate eventually. And a lot of people are under the assumption that lactate is a waste product. It's unusable once it is lactate, but that is not the case. Lactate is just a byproduct of glycolysis, and it can actually be used as fuel still. So that lactate can travel through the blood and eventually get to the liver. And at the liver, that is where the second process, glucogenesis, occurs. The lactate is able to convert to pyruvate and then eventually to glucose with the help of some ATP. And this is basically a process that is reversing glycolysis, if you will, getting that lactate back to a usable glucose molecule. That glucose is able to travel back through the blood, and it makes it all the way over to the muscle so that it can be metabolized further. Now I would like to consider how exercise affects this lactate pathway. So once again, exercise intensity dictates the type of metabolism that we are dealing with. So lower intensity exercise, it's going to use more of an aerobic pathway because the demand of oxygen isn't overpowering. Now, if the intensity is high, then there's going to be an oxygen deficit eventually created, and we're going to be using more of an anaerobic pathway. So exercise intensity dictates metabolic pathway. With that, if we're doing high intensity exercise, that's involving lots of oxygen and lots of energy fast, then we are more likely to be converting that pyruvate to lactate and putting that lactate through the Cori cycle anaerobically. Another thing to consider is the training adaptations that occur through exercise. There are lots of adaptations that can occur with regular exercise, but just to highlight a few. The first is mitochondria. So the mitochondria get bigger with training. They get bigger and stronger, and they're able to metabolize more with that oxygen. So if we have bigger mitochondria that are able to metabolize glucose aerobically for a longer period of time, then we aren't going to have to build up that lactate, and the muscle can continue to work efficiently. The second thing that happens with training is the lactate threshold increases. The lactate threshold is basically the point in which the amount of lactate that is built up hits a point where it increases exponentially, and the body is no longer able to keep up and clear that lactate for the muscle to continue to work. So with training, that lactate threshold increases, and the athlete or person that is exercising is able to go for a longer amount of time before that lactate accumulation builds up exponentially. Next, we're going to discuss lactate versus lactic acid. Lactate and lactic acid are often used synonymously, and although they are extremely similar, there are some key differences between the two, and it is important for us to just recognize these. So the first is lactic acid. And lactic acid is formed during anaerobic glycolysis. and that is the first byproduct of anaerobic glycolysis, but it quickly dissociates and it releases a hydrogen ion off of itself. As the hydrogen ion is released, it leaves carbon and oxygen, and that compound is left to combine with other things around it, and that is where lactate comes in. Lactate is formed from the remaining compound of lactic acid, which is that carbon and oxygen, after it dissociates, and it is combined with either sodium or potassium in the body, and that combination creates the lactate. Now, a lot of the times, lactate is the final product of that anaerobic glycolysis, but there is a fine line between the two, mostly the loss of the hydrogen ion. Now, the Cori cycle does not last infinitely. Lactate can be metabolized as long as there is enough energy for that Cori cycle to continue converting that lactate back into glucose. But as I mentioned in the previous slides, the liver requires 6 ATP to get that process going, and as we know from before, glycolysis requires 2 ATP to get that process going. So when we are doing a high intensity exercise, there is only so long of a time that the muscle can keep up with the demands, and eventually it is going to fatigue. Now, when it fatigues, that means that the lactate is starting to build up, and there's also hydrogen ions that are starting to build up. This buildup of lactate and hydrogen ions creates an acidic environment for the muscle, and the muscle does not like to contract in that acidic environment. In fact, the hydrogen ions are responsible for that burning sensation that many people feel when they're doing a high intensity exercise and their muscles begin to fatigue. When the muscles fatigue, they eventually just don't want to work anymore, and the athlete has to take a break. And depending on their level of training, that rest period is going to be different for everyone. The body tries to recover from that lactate buildup, and then once it does, it can continue to perform movements. Now, there are other factors that can also contribute to muscle fatigue besides just the lactate buildup. A couple that I could think of are muscle strength. So, like I said before, depending on the training level of the athlete, the muscle is going to fatigue faster or slower. If they have large muscles and lots of fibers built up, then those bigger, larger muscle fibers aren't going to fatigue as fast because they are able to recruit stronger fibers to perform the action. And the second thing that I thought of was poor nutrition. So our bodies need specific things in order to function, and that is the same for a muscle. The muscle requires 2 key things in contracting, which are sodium and potassium. So if those are missing from the diet and are lacking, then the muscle is not going to contract efficiently or not at all. And also, if the athlete is poorly hydrated, the lack of water is also not going to help with muscle contraction and lead to faster fatigue.